Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Lightning and the Few by Patrick Larsimont, narrated by Antony Ferguson. Prologue. Dunkirk, March 1990. Dr. Melanie McNabb was freezing and wished she had worn a jacket over her Imperial War Museum overalls. The sea breeze was tugging at her clothes, and her mouth was gritty with blown sand. She always liked to look the part. IWM logo on her breast and hard hat, the word stuff emblazoned across the shoulders. But this get-up was far from warm, waterproof, or any good at keeping out the blasted sand. Her hunter wellies had sprung a leak, and her left foot was squelching in a cold, damp sock. This was the least of her worries. Lucienne, the Neanderthal crane driver, in between leering looks, was being far too rough with the controls of the crane's extendable arm. He seemed to struggle to understand that this was an archaeological dig rather than some hole on a building site. The dig was of historical importance, and if her research and calculations were correct, could prove to be the final resting place of the Luftwaffe's top twin-engine fighter race of the Battle of Britain. Hauptmann Otto Werner was commander of ZG-26 and one of the first recipients of the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross with oak leaves. He was personally responsible for destroying 27 British and Allied aircraft before his death in July 1940, a notable achievement since all of his victories were against single-engine Spitfires and Hurricanes, rather than the multiple victories achieved later in the war by other Messerschmitt Bf-110 aces, taking down Allied bombers in a night fighter role. Peering into the impressive hole, Melanie could see where the burning aircraft had impacted all those years ago. It had hit the ground at such a velocity that it burrowed a good 15 feet, charring the sand and leaving a trail of black carbon through the pale granules. There shouldn't be much left of the Messerschmitt Bf-110 Zerstörer, or destroyer, and yet here it was, like some giant fossil of a flying pterodactyl or marine plesiosaur. It was huge, accommodating a two-man crew, armed with a 20mm cannon and machine guns to the front and rear. 12 meters long compared to the Spitfire's 8, it had twice the wingspan and 3 times the weight, but for all that, it had still been reduced to this rusting wreck. Melanie's deputy, Bobby Brown Stewart, perched precariously on the remains at the bottom of the pit. Above him, peering over the edge, was the man from the French Ministry of the Interior. Cold, windswept, and thoroughly fed up. Clipboard in hand and Gauloise at his lip, there was no risk of him doing anything even vaguely helpful. He was simply satisfied with muttering to the gaggle of local functionaries and the site owners' minders who were gathered nearby. "Just a bit lower, Mel," said Bobby. "Let me grab the chain and I'll try to get it around the fuselage. I'll hook it up behind the wing stubs." Melanie waved her hand at Lucienne, indicating what she hoped he'd understand as low and slow. For once he appeared to be concentrating on her hand signals rather than her rear end, and the chain lowered inch by inch. Bobby grabbed it with padded work gloves, and using the slack, he looped the chain under the fuselage, clipping it up through a hinged D-ring. He indicated, "All stop, hold tight," then scrambled around the wreck, carefully loosening the crust of charred sand and debris that had embraced it for the last 5 decades. He had a shiny trowel in his hand, and it took a while before he was satisfied that no damage would occur to the fragile infrastructure as it was extracted. He clambered up an aluminium ladder, a look of sheer delight on his face. He was as excited as Melanie about this recovery. Once clear of its damp grave, the wreck groaned, as unfamiliar pressure bore on joints, bolts, and welding unused to movement for years. The pair from the IWM held their breath as it slowly rotated before emerging into the light. Once clear of the surface, Lucienne skillfully panned what looked like the carcass of an ancient dragon over to a large white tarpaulin pegged out on the wind-blown surface of the beach. Lumps of wet sand fell, splattering loudly and making them both jump. Melanie recognized the faded outline of the white Hahn or cockerel, emblem of the 9th staffel of the aircraft's shattered nose. Down the side of the fuselage were the faint remains of the aircraft's identifier letters, and on the ragged tail assembly the stripes of several victory bars. Melanie's breath quickened as she realized the evidence was mounting up. Her heart pounded as the rusting frame was lowered. The man from the ministry leant forward as Melanie turned to give Lucienne the biggest smile she could muster. Against all expectations, he'd managed the extraction without damaging her precious cargo. There was very little left of the aircraft's canopy. No struts, no perspex, not even the usual rear-facing MG-15 machine gun. Handled by the aircraft's Bordfunker, the radio man and air gunner, it was usually there to pack a nasty punch to any attacker approaching from the rear. Here, the Bordfunker in question was 21-year-old Gefreiter Rudi Wattmacher, who had jumped clear of the burning aircraft, landing in the dunes with burns and a shattered leg. He'd recovered and survived the war, going on to live in Leipzig as a cabinet maker, before finally succumbing to cancer the previous year at the age of 72. It was his testimony, recorded by the IWM, that had first indicated that the grave of his illustrious commander, Hauptmann Otto Werner, may not be in the depths of the English Channel, as had always been believed, but rather inland, here, amidst the grassy dunes within the perimeter of the ArcelorMittal steelworks west of Dunkirk. The watching group stood back as the structure was lowered onto the tarpaulin. Peering into the rear cockpit, Melanie could see the soft materials of the seat had been destroyed by a combination of fire and the passage of time. She noted the rectangular slot that usually encased the rear gunner's parachute was empty, suggesting it hadn't burned in situ. In other words, it had been used before the crash. Equally compelling was the debris in the forward cockpit. Whomever had flown here had not escaped, and there was a good chance of finding identifying evidence against the black sludge on the cockpit floor. Melanie picked through it gingerly with the medical forceps she had clipped onto her overalls. Any items of potential interest were carefully bagged and labelled for later inspection. Amongst them were charred material and leather, fragments that looked like damp sticks but were possibly bone, and then small white pebbles, which on closer inspection were definitely teeth. The police would now have to be involved. Melanie began to feel guilty about her ghoulish enthusiasm. Down the left side of the cockpit, she found a metal disc covered in cracked glass. She wiped it gently against the sleeve of her overalls, recognizing the remains of a wristwatch. The hands and hour pips had been lost to the flames, but within the recessed date panel, the number 27 was clearly visible. Her heart leapt at this new piece of tangible evidence. "Bloody hell, have a look at this, Bobby," she said, holding it up with a trembling hand. They both knew Gefreiter Rudi Wattmacher's aircraft was shot down on the 27th of July, 1940. Peering closely at the item in his palm, Bobby looked up with a beaming smile. "It's a match, Mel! It's a bloody match!" Her curiosity piqued, Melanie began to rummage furiously. "Take it easy, Mel. We don't want to damage or miss anything important." "I'm sorry, you're right. I'm a bit overexcited," she mumbled, continuing to search. Amongst the debris of the left footwell, there was something wedged beneath a charred foot pedal. It was an unimpressive black Teutonic cross about 2 inches wide. She wiped it carefully to reveal the date 1939, and at its center found the unmistakable sign of the swastika. The cross's edges were trimmed with rolled silver, and across the top edge there was a little loop attached to a bulbous shape. She gently brushed the finger of her glove across it, wiping away the accumulated soot to reveal the delicate shape of an oak leaf. This was it, a knight's cross with oak leaves. Die Ritterkreuz des Eisernkreuzes mit Eichenlaub. Originally created on 3rd June 1940, up until the 15th of July 1941, It was the highest military honor that could be bestowed upon any German serviceman. Ordinary Knight's Crosses had existed before and were highly prized, but the addition of the oak leaves was the supreme honor and was closely associated with the Battle of France and the beginning of what the Germans called the Kanalkampf, and the British, the Battle of Britain. There was no doubting now, this was Hauptmann Otto Werner's aircraft. She had found her missing ace, but that wasn't why the smile that lit up her face slowly dissolved as her eyes filled with tears. This was a historically significant find, but was also an important personal milestone for Dr. Melanie McNabb. The man who had inspired her from earliest childhood, telling her she could achieve anything she dreamt of, was undoubtedly looking down at her right now. To Melanie, he was Grandpa Bang Bang, but to the rest of the world, he was Group Captain Jeremy A.E. McNabb, GC, DSO, MC, DFC and Bar, or more simply put, the legendary fighter ace Jocks McNabb. When still a pimply 19-year-old on the 27th of July 1940, he had battled for his life against an awesomely skilled and monstrously huge enemy, and then against all conceivable odds, the terrified boy had emerged victorious. Her grandpa was never credited with this aerial victory, but Melanie knew it was a fight which had haunted his memory to the end of his days. The most terrifying contest in Jocks McNabb's very long war. Chapter 1. Dollar, Scotland, June 1939. This will not do, McNabb. Your time with us has been exemplary, and Mr. Ma tells me you've been a diligent house prefect, but this behaviour is completely unacceptable and cannot be tolerated. If it had been just you, a sixth former, letting off a little steam after the exams, we might have shown some latitude. But with inebriated younger boys involved, my hands are tied. I have no alternative but to send you down, concluded the rector. And that was it. Jocks McNabb was expelled from the Dollar Academy, the school he'd attended since he was 4 years old. He'd never liked the place much, but it was the closest thing to a home he'd ever had. His mother had died when he was a boy, and overcome with grief, his father had thought boarding school was the only way he could cope. Now he was a big noise in the Indian civil service. Jocks knew him only as a rather cold and haughty man who saw his son as an irritant, a sad reminder of the past. He would certainly be unimpressed by his only son's expulsion, not least since their last exchange of letters had focused on his singular lack of ambition for the future. It had started innocently enough. He and his friend Andy Allen and some of the other sixth form leavers had decided to sneak out of their boarding houses to meet up for a quick drink in one of the sleepy pubs, away from the town of Dollar in Clackmannanshire. After all, they would soon be men about town, most of them 18, and it was a perfect summer's evening, just 2 weeks before the end of term. He hadn't thought it was a great idea when a couple of fifth formers joined them, but he'd always liked Ralph Campbell, a lad in his boarding house, who was good for a laugh and was next year's cricket captain. For all his sporting prowess, though, Ralph proved no match for the couple of frothy pints they'd enjoyed in the beer garden overlooked by the Ochils, at the back of the Woolpack Inn in nearby Tillicoultry. It was still late, not even 9, when they jogged back to Dollar in high spirits and probably making too much noise. Ralph giggled most of the way, but suddenly stopped, turned quite pale, and then did just that. Ralph. Anxiety levels rose immediately as they realized the young cricketer was paralytic, and they'd have a job sneaking him back into the house unobserved. With scouts posted, a burly pair of them frog-marched him along, finally managing to get him tucked up in one of the locker rooms. Leaving Ralph to sober up, they scattered to be as far away as possible if he got spotted, trusting the schoolboy code of honor that he would never clape on the others. It was only once all the miscreants were rounded up that Jocks learnt of the path to his ruin. Ralph had been marched into the housemaster's front parlour and had promptly thrown up on a prized Paisley-patterned carpet. After threats of losing his cricket captaincy were made, Ralph sang like a canary. Which explained how Jocks found himself in the rector's office the following morning, sweating alcohol from every pore, under the unwavering eye of the rector, Harry Bell, OBE. "Leading younger boys astray is quite unacceptable. Your time with us may be over, but I consider your behaviour in regard to young Campbell and the other boys as wilful sabotage of promising school careers, and indeed their future prospects. Your father will have to be told, and I will be drafting a telegram this afternoon. I understand you have an aunt in Stirling, Mrs. Jean Easton, with whom you will be staying. I'm disappointed things have come to this, McNabb, and sincerely hope this unpleasantness will act as a shock and set you onto the right track. Your country and the Empire needs educated young men with vigour, but always tempered with self-discipline and respect. I am assured you possess the former, but sadly not yet the rest. It is time for you to buck up." Jocks was given until tea time to clear his lockers, pack up his trunk, and have it ready for collection by the porter. Mr. Marr would ensure he had a single fare train ticket to Stirling, and enough pocket money for a hackneyed carriage at the other end. In the meantime, he was encouraged to say his goodbyes and bid a final farewell to the familiar grounds that had been part of his life for so long. The rector escorted Jocks down the stairs from his office to the impressive bronze doors through which all leavers left the academy. Jocks turned and shook hands with both masters for the first and last time, and the bronze doors clanged ominously shut behind him. Feeling pretty low, he slunk towards the school war memorial. Casting a final look back at the school, he wondered what the hell he was going to do. Maybe the Navy. But as soon as the thought entered his head, he knew it was a non-starter. He'd got sick on the school fishing trip on Loch Leven and had always hated the interminable passenger liner journeys when visiting his father in India. Whenever he returned to school, people always thought it was some tropical disease, but it was seasickness which caused his pallor, rather than malaria, bilharzia, or dengue fever. "What about you?" Jocks asked the pleading boy on the sandstone plinth of the memorial. "What do you think I should do?" The youth looked beseechingly into the gloriously blue sky, filled with fluffy white cumulus. "What would you know? Look at where your advice led these poor fellows." Jocks knew the names of all 183 men listed on the monument by heart. All of the pupils did. The list was for the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, the regiment most closely associated with the school. He'd once written an essay about Lieutenant Colonel Gavin Laurie Wilson, winner of the DSO at Ypres, the MC at the Somme, and a quadrilleur en palme from the grateful French, who died of Spanish flu at the age of 24 at the military hospital in Étaples. He was a local tiliculture boy with a father who was a master at the school. "What do you think, Gavin? You knew what you were about, a colonel at 24? A throaty sound made Jock start. The beseeching look on the youth's face remained unchanged as clouds slipped through his open fingers. Jocks cocked his head as the noise grew louder, and he turned to find it. He caught a movement between the statue's outstretched arms as he recognized the distinctive sound of a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Flying very low over the school was a Hawker Hurricane Mark I. It swooped as the pilot tried to impress some schoolgirl sweetheart, or perhaps amuse a younger sibling. The sight of an aircraft practicing aerobatics in the summer skies above the school had become more frequent, a response to tensions following Mr. Hitler's annexation of the Sudetenland last year, and then the rest of Czechoslovakia just a few weeks ago. The aircraft was directly overhead, and Jocks ducked at the impressive roar. His mood lifted immediately, seeing the glorious warbird execute a breathtaking series of rolls to the delight of the boys and girls scattered across the playing fields. Others filed out from their classrooms to witness the display, all waving and cheering enthusiastically. The pilot waggled his wings, and the bright sun reflected from the distinctive hump of his Hurricane. The engine backfired dramatically as he pulled up, then swooped back down over the school, to the delight of his young audience. Jock's eyes didn't leave him for an instant. He felt his heart swell. Perhaps it was fate calling, but that was when he noticed, on either side of the red, white and blue RAF roundel, picked out in bright yellow, the aircraft's identifying letters. GXM, as in Jock's McNabb. He knew his destiny was set. A few months later, Jock's was in London, face-to-face with Patrick McGonigal, chairman of the RAF Pilot Selection Board. "Jeremy Argyle Easton McNabb, is it? Your school housemaster seems to think rather highly of you, Mr. McNabb," said McGonigal. "Ah, he does," replied Jock, somewhat thrown. "Well, yes. I flew with Lawrence during the last war, a very fine aviator, transferred from Naval Air Service to join us in the Royal Flying Corps. You seem surprised." "No, sir. Mr. Marr is an excellent English master, and I've learnt a great deal from him, but I wasn't aware he'd been asked to provide an opinion on my application. We like to canvass views on our candidates," said the chairman, peering through the gold-rimmed spectacles on the tip of his nose. "It says here, Jeremy is a lively young chap, independently minded, nonconformist but bright, technically astute, and an excellent role model to the younger boys. He's a fine rugby player and cricketer, an excellent shot who has competed for the school regularly at Bisley. He will undoubtedly do well in his higher examinations. There. What do you have to say?" "Well, that's very kind of him, sir. And how did you in fact fare in your exams?" 3 A's and 5 B's, sir." "Maths and sciences?" "Yes, sir. All 3, and maths. I got A's in biology, English and French." "Vous parlez donc français?" "Oui, monsieur, un peu." "On your application here you say, 'I want to serve my country and explore the freedom of the skies.' Are you a poet, McNabb? 'I wandered lonely as a cloud' and all of that?" "Well, no, not exactly, sir," replied Jock, his heart sinking as he was making such a mess of things. "It's the freedom of solo flight which appeals to me, being in control of my own destiny. I hoped my aptitude for mechanics and being a good shot might perhaps make fighters a good fit." "I see," replied his inquisitor. "You are aware that volunteering for the RAF, should you be successful, may well require going to war. It's no secret Germany is threatening Poland's sovereignty, and should they attack, Great Britain and France will have no choice but to declare war. This is no boy's own adventure you're embarking upon. This is brutal, bloody war. Sadly, I speak with some experience of the carnage of the last war. Yes, sir, I understand. I want to do my duty for my king and country." "Good lad. I see your father is in the India office." "Yes, sir." "He supports your application, I presume? You do seem rather young to me." "Yes, sir, absolutely," lied Jock. "Well, thank you for your time, Mr. McNabb. Please hand this slip to the sergeant outside. He will advise you of the arrangements. If you do see Lawrence, please pass on the fondest regards of Paddy McGonigal, and be sure to be grateful, my boy. Good day to you." Jock looked at the blue slip of paper in his hand, unsure of its significance. He stuttered, "Yes, sir, I will, sir, thank you. Good morning to you." The rest of the day was spent wandering the corridors of Adderstrel House in Kingsway and being prodded, evaluated and tested. Jock's principal recollection was of queuing up bollock naked as a succession of men with clipboards viewed the candidates from various angles. Once deemed physically fit, competent and FFI, free from infection, principally of the venereal kind, he was allocated a number, 41276, a pay book, and an advance on his pay. He was ordered to make his way to number 18 EFTS, Elementary Flying Training School, at Fair Oaks Aerodrome, near Woking in Surrey, during the last week of August 1939. The initial flight training for candidate aircrew had been outsourced to civilian aviation companies, in this case Universal Flying Services, since during the Great War the RAF had learnt the costly consequences of sending half-trained men to the front to learn flight skills at a squadron level. Volunteers would now learn to fly first on biplanes taught by civilian instructors. Chapter 2. Sitting in the back of the jolting lorry which picked them up from Woking Station, Jocks appraised the other 4 chaps he'd met at the station. George Milne was the son of a wealthy sheep farmer. He was tall and had big hands and a surprisingly feminine face, with big eyes, long eyelashes, and a shy smile. He spoke quietly and had an accent from somewhere in the north of England. He appeared to be great chums with a cheeky chap called Morgan Chalmers, nicknamed Moggs, whose people owned coal mines in Northumberland. Chalmers was shorter, with a big nose and reddish-blonde hair, and was full of energy and seemed a bit of a rascal. Sandy Bullough was the youngest of the group, younger even than Jocks, and looked it. He was small, underweight, and rather twitchy, with dark hair and teeth that were too big for his mouth. He came from South Africa and seemed very knowledgeable about what the next 10 weeks would bring. He was the only member of the group with any actual flight experience, with his uncle apparently high up in the RAF, and his family pillars of the Jewish community in Durban. They also owned a biplane to fly on the weekends. The last chap was called David Pritchard. He was a Londoner and had dark curly hair, blue eyes, and a bristly square jaw, reminding Jocks of Biggles, the flying comic book hero who was all the rage at school. Jocks had always rather fancied himself as a bit of a James Bigglesworth character, since he too was born in India and was the son of an administrator in the Indian civil service. But sadly, compared to Pritchard, he wasn't even close. Irritated, he was determined not to like him. Pritchard didn't help the case by making them wait for him, and then in a rush, hurling his canvas kit bag into the back of the lorry, winding Jocks in the process. Adding insult to injury, he shoved up against him, saying, "Move over, shorty, big lad coming through. Sorry to keep you waiting, boys. I needed a pee." There weren't many things Jocks was sensitive about, but one was perhaps his height. He wasn't tiny like Bullough, but he had to acknowledge he was shorter than many of his peers. He was stocky enough to be a useful hooker, but tall he wasn't. Otherwise, with straight brown hair, a pronounced widow's peak, and pale green eyes, he held his own in the looks department, but this bloody Biggles chap was in another league. Jocks tried to ignore him, but on the way up the road, he soon fell for the stream of jokes, tales and commentary delivered by Pritchard in an endearing mock Cockney twang. He was a Londoner through and through, but from well-to-do Wimbledon, and had been to school at King's College. A few years older than the rest, he was full of tales of West End girls, South London gangs, and the year-long tour of Europe he'd just completed in his father's 4¼ litre 1936 Bentley. He spoke of the black shirts he'd seen in Italy, the torchlit Nazi parades in Germany, and the columns of exhausted blue-clad soldiers he'd seen marching along the tree-lined roads of France. "These are interesting times, my boys, and I reckon we're heading for the best place to live them. Hold on tight and we'll be flying over momentous events," he said with infectious enthusiasm. Jocks was excited by the prospect, but wondered if he would be up to playing his part in what the gathering storm clouds of war promised. His thoughts darkened as they made their way through the woods of Horsell Common and approached the aerodrome. According to Sandy Bullough, who had all the gen, it was originally called Dolly's Farm when requisitioned by the Air Ministry in 1936. Out of a motley collection of fields and an old farmhouse, the airfield now had grown to 2 hangars, a control tower, some offices, and a parachute tower. There were also workshop facilities and a flight of bright yellow tiger moths to provide elementary flight training for prospective RAF pilots. "Gentlemen, let me speak plainly," said the chief flying instructor in his welcome speech. You are not yet in the RAF, in spite of what your paybooks may suggest. Some of you may make it, but others will not. Look around and ask yourself whether you measure up. The 16 of them eyed one another surreptitiously. You are probationary pupil pilots and have 50 hours of flying time on the DH-82 Tiger Moths parked outside to prove your worth. There will be lectures to attend, exams to pass, and our expectation is that after 10 hours of dual-control flight, you will fly solo. You will then use the balance of your flight time to gain experience and develop skills before your final tests. You will be evaluated weekly, and there are final written examinations too. The weeding out process begins now and will be overseen by myself and the chief ground instructor, Mr. Brownlee. He indicated a rotund gentleman in tan overalls, worn over a shirt and tie, with stern eyes and a piercing gaze. It will be our task to dispense the bowler hats to the least deserving amongst you. In the evening, back at their surprisingly luxurious accommodation at the nearby Ottershaw Park estate, the gang assembled to discuss this peculiar reference to headwear. "Don't you know anything about the service?" asked Bullough disparagingly. "Being handed a bowler hat is RAF jargon for getting the boot and being sent back to Civvy Street." "Crikey," said Pritchard. "Doesn't bode well. Well, best of luck, lads. I think we're going to need it." The following morning, they made their way on foot to their new home for the next 10 weeks. The airfield was waking up to a new day, and the smells, sounds, and activity were exhilarating. Jocks loved the heady combination of doped canvas, aviation fuel, oil, leather, and exhaust fumes. The firing engines and spinning propellers pulsated in his ears. As he walked between the yellow Tiger Moth biplanes, his heart was thumping, and he felt more excited than ever before. He knew he was embarking on a great and noble endeavour. First, he was issued with his flying kit. Overalls, a one-piece Sidcot padded flying suit, a leather helmet, split goggles, and elbow-high flying gauntlets. At least now he looked the part. Next, he was introduced to Newitt, his flying instructor, a short, intense man with a thick moustache, a pipe, and tatty RFC wings sewn onto a civilian jacket. They circled his allocated aircraft, with Newitt pointing out the flaps, ailerons, and a flurry of other terms which went in and out of Jocks's ears in short order. He explained how the controls on the Tiger Moth worked and the rudiments of flight. "You pull the column back to climb," said Newitt. "Push forward to dive. This is how the rudder bar works. I will explain the effect of airflow over the wing surfaces, and then what this allows you to do with the aircraft." Jocks was given a parachute, had a 5-minute chat about what to do in case of need, jump, count to 3, pull the ring, and was then told to hop into the back seat and strap in for a spin. The propeller was swung by a mechanic, and the engine coughed to life. As the aircraft gathered speed, it rattled and bumped along the grass runway, and Jocks hung on, absolutely terrified. "I'll never get the hang of this," he thought. "Why did I think this was for me?" The furious bumping and vibrations suddenly stopped. They had left the ground. Still terrified, he looked down and saw they were well and truly airborne. The ground receded, and the sensation of travelling at speed vanished, as a breathtaking view unfolded before them. Far below were the leafy woods of Horsell Common, and in the mid-distance, Chobham, and further away, Woking. They banked over Ottershaw Manor, beyond which he could see the smoky smudge of the outskirts of London. The sheer beauty of the landscape unfolding before him and this unfamiliar perspective on the world filled Jocks with an exhilarating sense of independence. He knew this was his calling, and now he just had to fulfill his potential. A voice in the speaking tube interrupted his rapture. "Not too shabby, eh? Not feeling ill? It's a lovely day for a spin," said Newitt. "Right then, if you're comfortable, let's see what you've got. I'll talk you through the controls, demonstrate what they do, and then you'll have a go." Newitt looked back at him and gave a thumbs up. Jocks swallowed and nodded back. Take the stick gently and follow what I do. Note the effect which each action has on the aircraft. Try to feel it in your body, through your buttocks. Jocks seized the stick and the plane juddered and dropped. Take it easy, lad. I said follow me through the stick, not wrestle the bugger off me. She's a flighty mare, now calm down. Do things smoothly and gradually. Everything is slow, relaxed, and in minute increments. This set the tone for the next several days. They were first applied to flying straight and level, then attempting takeoff, followed by circuits of the airfield, then bumpy, often very bumpy landings. Jocks was taught to spin, to avoid, then to deal with stalls. Next, everything went back to the beginning, but this time with greater precision and instructor scrutiny. It was a steep learning curve, particularly when diving, looping and banking were added to the mix. Mistakes were common and panic-inducing since the actions to retrieve a situation were often counterintuitive. Instinct snatched at the controls, causing overcorrections, and any lapses in concentration could have lethal consequences. Newitt repeatedly explained, "The secret is to stay relaxed. Avoid any sudden movements and try to settle yourself into the fabric of the machine. Become part of it." Jocks soon discovered Newitt's tell for when he was feeling anxious. He would tersely address Jocks as Mr. McNabb. But when relaxed, a plume of blue smoke from his pipe blew back from the front cockpit. Jocks would forever associate the smell of mellow Virginia with success. The first bowler hat went to a chap called Llewellyn. Blond and pale, he was a nervous fellow, too heavy-handed with the controls. After 3 bone-crunching landings in a row, his instructor refused to continue and he was sent on his way. The second sacking hit much closer to home. Their little gang from the lorry ride had become a tight clique, each with an unofficial role. David Pritchard was the joker, and George Milne the earnest conscience of the group. Morgan Chalmers was the rascal, whilst Sandy Bullough was the insider and know-it-all. Finally, Jocks was considered the fearless one, ready to take on any challenge. Unified by their ambition to become pilots, they had become a tight unit. Which was why what happened to Bullough was such a shock. He was the one they all thought was a shoo-in to pass, but was the first amongst them to be weeded out. He hadn't done well in the written assessments, thinking them all rather beneath him. His real downfall, though, was thinking he knew it all. This inability to take instruction finished him off. One moment he was there, the next he was gone. "You were warned this would be brutal," said Mr. Brownlee. "More of you will fail than succeed. Mark my words and get on with it." After a particularly nauseating session of aerobatics with Newitt, they were practicing recovery from spins, and Jocks was discovering the stomach-churning reality of aerial combat. They had practiced several landings and takeoffs in a row when they pulled to the side of the taxiway. "Feeling all right, Mr. McNabb?" Jocks was instantly on edge, replying nervously, "Yes, sir." "Don't switch her off. Put the brake on while I get out. Then you take her up for a spin." He was going solo. Newitt clambered out and stood back from the Tiger Moth, his hands on his hips. Jocks trembled in the cockpit. His mouth was parched, and his mind had gone completely blank of everything he'd ever been taught. He didn't know how long he stared at the dials in terror, but was shaken out of it by a punch to the shoulder, and Newitt shouting over the noise of the engine, "Get a bloody move on, I haven't got all day. Taxi out and line her up properly, then take her once around like we've just done. Bring her back in one piece. You can do it, lad. On you go." The Tiger Moth fishtailed up the grass runway. Jocks' takeoff was ragged and bumpy. Once free from the ground, he rose smoothly and swung around the airfield as he had dozens of times before. His landing was rather heavy and involved 3 thumping bounces, but with a flick of the stick he got her down. He taxied shakily back to the apron where Newitt was waiting and gave him the thumbs up. Jocks switched off, clambered from the cockpit, and slung his parachute over his shoulder. Newitt had a grin on his face, his pipe in his mouth, and his hand extended toward Jocks. They shook and walked to the crew room, where Newitt would sign his logbook to confirm his solo. They entered the hut in high spirits, but found the others clustered silently around the wireless. The clock on the wall ticked past 11 in the morning. "What's going on?" asked Jocks. "Shut up, just listen," replied Pritchard. The well-spoken voice of man came over the scratchy airwaves. Jocks recognized the received pronunciation of Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. "I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland. A state of war would exist between us." The anxious listeners glanced at each other nervously. "I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany." Chapter 3. Jocks had forgotten how bloody cold Scotland could get, especially this windswept corner of East Forfarshire, exposed to the very worst of the November gales rolling straight in from the North Sea. RAF Montrose at Broomfield Farm was about the bleakest spot to learn advanced flying as you could possibly choose. Officially No. 8 Service Flying School, when Jocks and his companions arrived from sunny Fair Oaks in leafy Surrey, the prospect of flying at this dreich field, buffeted by wind and rain, was far from inviting. "Aye, Baltic right enough," said the corporal at the gate. To the blue-lipped, numb-toed acting pilot officers, it might as well have been Mars. Jocks, the Scotsman amongst them, was expected to know his way around, but he was as lost, wet, and thoroughly dejected as the rest. Only 9 of the original 16 had made it through solo flight to pass the 22 air experience stages required to complete elementary training. They had then spent 2 weeks at RAF Uxbridge, west of London, enduring hours of drill, physical fitness training, and lectures on the short, illustrious history of the RAF. These were followed by classes on the administrative duties and protocols expected of prospective RAF officers. Jocks took to the marching, polishing, and discipline well enough, since in truth it wasn't so different from school. He'd been issued with a rough woolen blue uniform, a pair of shiny black boots, a web belt, and a forage cap with a white band. He felt hungry all the time, generally lacked sleep, and slowly became irritated by the belligerent nature of the training cadre, but knew better than to open his mouth. They were led by a Cockney flight sergeant, whose words of welcome had not boded well. "Right, you horrible little works. Since we are at war, the RAF has deemed you have what it takes to become officers and gentlemen. I, for one, cannot see it, particularly since it's taken me 12 years to earn these here stripes and crown on my arms. You will therefore understand I am hardly impressed that you rabble are already sergeants. Over the next few weeks it will be my task, alongside my staff, real corporals and sergeants mind, to ensure you earn those bloody stripes, and believe me, they will be bloody." And they were, but at least the torment didn't last too long. It was a rite of passage to be endured, and with the war looming, suffering in common did much to bring the recruits together. There were lighter moments too. For example, when bespoke tailors arrived to measure the fledgling pilots for their officers' uniforms. The rough old airmen's blues were soon to be replaced with tailor-made slate blue uniforms fit for officers and gentlemen. In addition, as Uxbridge was one of the RAF's larger stations, they were allowed access to the excellent officers' mess, leading to well-lubricated, laughter-filled evenings spent together. When their postings were finally announced, By some miracle, Jocks's little gang of David Pritchard, George Milne, and Morgan Chalmers were all assigned to No. 8 Service Flying School at RAF Montrose in Scotland. The four of them were to be joined for the trip north by Roy Digger Callender, a jovial Australian, and Morris Moose Grant, a dark-haired giant from Ontario, Canada. Just before the train journey via London, their new uniforms were delivered, still devoid of coveted wings, but with a thin pilot officer's stripe at the sleeve. Feeling rather smart and with a newfound swagger, the gang boarded at King's Cross through clouds of swirling steam and the stink of burning coal. They were in a single compartment and settled down for what was going to be a long journey, especially with phony war anxieties over enemy attacks on rail and transport hubs. When the chatty ticket inspector checked their travel warrants, he was respectful to their new uniforms, but warned of delays due to shenanigans up the line. He saluted them, like the old soldier he undoubtedly was, saying, "My apologies, sir. I'm afraid it's the war." He added sadly, "Christ, I never thought I'd have to say that again in my lifetime. My heart goes out to you. Bless you and Godspeed." Jocks felt like a fraud and was embarrassed to be called sir by someone older than his father. It was an uncomfortable novelty, but made him wonder what the future had in store for his little gang of chaps. No one was expecting them when they finally arrived at the airfield. It took the corporal of the guard quite a while to find anyone willing to take responsibility for the new arrivals. In the meantime, they stood out in the rain, self-conscious in their sodden new uniforms, no longer glamour boys, but rather drowned rats. They were surrounded by vintage hangars from the Great War, which they later discovered were known as Major Burke's Sheds, named for the airfield's first CO. Made of slatted wood, they formed a semicircle facing the beach and the North Sea. In sunnier climes, this coastline might have been inviting, but here it was flat, windswept, and bleak. RAF Montrose was the oldest military airfield in Scotland, created in 1912. It had 2 track runways which crossed over, and a taxiway roughly in the shape of a sock, its heel to the sea. There were newer steel-clad hangars with tall sliding doors, plus maintenance sheds and a control tower creaking in the buffeting wind. Invisible from above were deep bomb shelters, hidden ammunition stores, and a network of concrete pillboxes dotting the beachfront, defences against seaborne and airborne threats. This was home for No. 8 Service Flying Training School, FTS, as well as No. 269 Maritime Patrol Squadron, who were rotating out, and No. 603 City of Edinburgh Squadron, due in from January. The training school was equipped with Avro Ansons for twin-engine instruction and North American Harvard Mark Is for single-engine fighter training. When leaving Uxbridge, those selected for fighter training were grouped together. Jocks, David Pritchard, Morris Grant, George Milne, Morgan Chalmers, and Roy Callender. Chalmers teased Grant, saying, "Look at the bloody size of you. How on earth are you going to fit into a fighter? Now me, I'm perfectly proportioned to be a fighter pilot, but how's a big lunk like you going to manage? Makes no bloody sense." "Don't worry about me, little man," replied the placid Canuck. "Concentrate on getting through the next phase of training. Think of the poor chaps who didn't make it and were sent home. We're lucky to still be in it. I reckon things will get a whole lot tougher and the pressure's on. To the RAF, we're still civilians and have 16 weeks to prove ourselves. That's what you should focus on." After a good hour exposed to the worst of the elements, the new arrivals were taken in hand by an unsmiling warrant officer whose Scots accent was incomprehensible even to Jocks. They were marched off in squelching parade shoes to a metal hangar, then told to wait. Almost immediately, they were startled by the WO's snarl. "Attention! Get on your feet, you bleeding shower! Station commander on parade!" An older gentleman with neat grey hair introduced himself as Wing Commander Robertson. He had RFC wings on his tunic and medal ribbons from the Great War and colonial service across the empire. He spoke through a peppery moustache which curled up at the tips, but seemed to struggle to stand still, with a stooped back obviously giving him trouble. In his speech he covered what they should expect from the forthcoming weeks and what would be required of them. It flowed from a stern welcome to a more encouraging pep talk. He spoke with candor, integrity, and a deep understanding of the subject matter. He concluded by asking for their dedication and wished them well. Good intentions, enthusiasm, and rigor will take you a long way, gentlemen, but be vigilant at all times. Our weather here is treacherous. The cemetery at Sleeping Hillock is filled with airmen who trained here during the last war and this. I received a letter from an American pilot the other day who trained here in 1918, recalling a crash every day and a funeral every week. So be warned. The wind is unforgiving, and you are learning your craft on unfamiliar steeds. Be very careful, my boys. We need you to stay in one piece to face our enemies. Thank you, and my very best wishes. After a hot meal and a change of clothing, Jocks was allocated a warm room with Pritchard, and it wasn't too long before he started feeling human again. Sleep eluded him, though, with his mind racing, anxious about what the new day would bring. When Jocks joined the others for a hearty breakfast of porridge and eggs, Chalmers and Milne were squabbling as usual. To interrupt them, Jocks said, "George, why did you sign up?" "I dunno." "Well, I was disappointed in love," declared Calendar unexpectedly. "Yeah, a bit of a cliché, but the girl I was going to marry decided she preferred someone else. I had a great engineering job in Sydney, and we were all set for life together, when she decided I wasn't exciting enough and ran off with some bloke in the Navy. It was the flashy uniform, I reckon." He laughed bitterly. "Right, I thought, I'll show her. What's the most glamorous thing I could think of? Becoming a pilot, I reckoned, so I did my basic back in Oz, then hopped on the boat to Blighty to be here with you blokes. Apart from the weather, I'm delighted to be here. Not too keen on this cold, mind." "That's as good a reason as any, Roy," Milne said. "I'm just a farmer who loves this land. Our land. I'll probably end up doing the same as my old dad and my uncles, working with the sheep. But before then I wanted to see the world a bit. Defend our country if needs be, and fight for the right to live how we want. I don't know too much about these Nazi fellows, but I'm told they're keen on bossing others about, so it's a good enough reason for me to stop them. If I'm going to fight, though, I won't be doing it down in the mud like in the last war. I'll do it up here." He pointed a long finger at the leaden skies outside the window. "That's me. What about you, Jocks?" Jocks sighed. "I'm here rather by accident. Got thrown out of school for something silly and was facing a world of recriminations from my father. I needed a plan for my life, when frankly I just didn't have one. I looked up and saw the answer. I'd become a pilot in the Royal Air Force. No one could ever say I wasn't good enough then. Not my father, not anyone. Sounds rather silly saying it out loud, but there you have it." "If you think that's daft, listen to this," said Pritchard. "I've spent the last year getting..."
We hope you enjoyed this preview. To continue listening to this audiobook on Google Play Books, use the link in the video description.